The dust rose in crimson clouds as another wagon rolled down Main Street, its wheels grinding against the sun-baked earth of Cedar Ridge. The late afternoon sun hung low over the jagged mountains, painting everything in shades of amber and rust. Margaret Whitmore stood on the wooden sidewalk outside her father's general store, watching the town go about its business with the same predictable rhythm it had maintained for the past decade. Cedar Ridge wasn't much to look at, a collection of weathered buildings huddled against the vast emptiness of the frontier, where the smell of burning grass mixed with horse sweat and gunpowder. But today was different. Today, the entire town had gathered to witness what folks were already calling the social event of the year. "There she is," someone whispered, and Margaret felt dozens of eyes turned toward her. She straightened her shoulders, smoothing down the blue cotton dress her mother had ordered from San Francisco. It felt foreign against her skin, too fine for this rough place, too delicate for the life she'd always known. Thomas Bancroft emerged from the bank across the street, his black suit immaculate despite the dust that coated everything else in town. At 28, he was already being groomed to take over his father's financial empire, an empire built on interest rates and foreclosures that left families homeless when the droughts came. His smile was practiced, calculated, like everything else about him. "My dear Margaret," he said, taking her hand with a proprietary air that made her stomach tighten. The crowd parted as he led her to the center of the street, where tables had been set up for the announcement. Her father, Samuel Whitmore, beamed with pride. After years of running the general store, watching other merchants fail while the Bancrofts grew richer, this union would secure his family's position in Cedar Ridge society. Her mother dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, already imagining grandchildren raised in the big house on the hill. Thomas cleared his throat, and the crowd fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause, leaving only the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. He reached into his vest pocket and produced a small velvet box. "Margaret Whitmore," he began, his voice carrying across the dusty street. "You would do me the greatest honor by accepting this token of my affection and my promise to make you my wife." He opened the box, and gasps rippled through the crowd. The diamond caught the dying light, throwing rainbow sparks across the weathered faces of townspeople who had never seen such wealth displayed so casually. It was larger than any gemstone that had ever graced Cedar Ridge, a clear statement of the Bancroft fortune and power. The town envied her diamond. Margaret would remember thinking later, as she watched their faces transform with awe and jealousy. Mrs. Patterson, the seamstress, clutched her worn shawl tighter. Jake Morrison, who'd lost his ranch to the bank last winter, spat tobacco juice into the dirt and turned away. Margaret's hand trembled as Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger. It felt heavy, cold despite the warmth of the evening. The crowd erupted in congratulations, but their voices seemed to come from very far away. She smiled and nodded, playing the part of the blessed bride-to-be, while something inside her chest grew tight and small. "A toast!" someone shouted, and bottles of whiskey appeared as if by magic. The men slapped Thomas on the back, already calculating what this alliance might mean for their own dealings with the bank. The women surrounded Margaret, their fingers reaching out to touch the ring, their compliments edged with something sharp. "You're the luckiest girl in the territory, Mrs." Bancroft declared, her severe face softening with satisfaction. "Thomas will give you everything a woman could want." Margaret nodded, the appropriate response. But her gaze drifted beyond the crowd to where the stables stood at the edge of town. A figure moved in the shadows there, tending to the horses with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that some creatures couldn't be bought with diamonds or promises. As the celebration continued around her, Margaret felt increasingly disconnected from it all. The laughter grew too loud, the congratulations too hollow. Thomas kept his hand possessively on her elbow, steering her from one group to another like a prize mare at auction. "I need some air," she finally whispered to him. His grip tightened. "Nonsense. Everyone wants to see you, to admire the ring. This is our moment, Margaret." Our moment. The words sat heavy in her chest. She looked down at the diamond. watching it fracture the light into 1,000 pieces, and wondered if that's what was happening to her, breaking apart into fragments that would never quite fit together again. The sun finally dipped behind the mountains, and lanterns were lit along Main Street. In their flickering glow, the diamond seemed to pulse with its own light, drawing every eye like a beacon. Margaret felt trapped in its brilliance, pinned like one of those butterflies in the collector's cases she'd seen in her father's catalogs. "I really must," she began again, and this time pulled away before Thomas could object. "Just for a moment. The heat." He frowned but released her, already turning to accept another round of congratulations from the banker from the neighboring town. Margaret slipped through the crowd, her chest tight with a need she couldn't name. The stables were quiet, a sanctuary of soft nickering and the sweet smell of hay. She pressed her back against the rough wooden wall, closing her eyes and trying to remember how to breathe. The diamond caught on her dress, its sharp edges snagging the fine fabric. "You all right, miss?" The voice was gentle, uncertain. Margaret opened her eyes to find a young man watching her from the stable entrance. She'd seen him before, of course. Everyone in Cedar Ridge knew everyone else. But she'd never really looked at him. Will Harper, the stable boy who'd arrived in town 2 winters ago with nothing but the clothes on his back and away with horses that had earned him steady work. In the fading light, she noticed things she'd overlooked before, the way his sandy hair fell across his forehead, still damp with honest sweat from a day's labor, the kindness in his brown eyes, free from the calculating gleam she'd grown accustomed to seeing in Thomas's gaze. His clothes were patched but clean, his boots worn but carefully maintained. "I'm fine," she said automatically, then surprised herself by adding, "No, that's not true. I'm not fine at all." He stepped closer, concern creasing his brow. "Should I fetch someone? Your father?" "No." The word came out sharper than she intended. "Please, no, I needed to get away from all that." Will nodded slowly, as if he understood more than she'd said. "Sometimes a person needs room to breathe," he offered. "The horses teach you that. Can't force them into anything. They'll let you know when they're ready." Margaret found herself really smiling for the first time all evening. "Are you comparing me to a horse, Mr. Harper?" He flushed, visible even in the dim light. "No, not exactly. Just that, well, forcing things doesn't usually end well for anyone involved." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the distant sounds of celebration and the closer, more peaceful sounds of horses settling for the night. Margaret realized this was the first time all day she'd felt like herself. "That's quite a ring," Will said quietly, and she saw him notice how she'd been unconsciously turning it on her finger. "Yes," she agreed, looking down at it. "The whole town's talking about it. The whole town envies it," he corrected gently. "But envying something and understanding its true cost, those are different things entirely." Margaret looked up sharply, surprised by the insight. Will Harper might work in the stables, but there was intelligence in those brown eyes, a depth that Thomas, for all his education, seemed to lack. "I should go back," she said reluctantly. "They'll come looking for me soon." "Of course." He stepped aside, careful not to crowd her. "Miss Whitmore, if you ever need a place to just breathe, the horses don't judge, and neither do I." She paused at the stable entrance, looking back at him silhouetted against the warm light of the lantern he'd lit. "Thank you, Mr. Harper. I might take you up on that." Walking back to the celebration, the diamond on her finger seemed to grow heavier with each step. The crowd had grown louder, more intoxicated, and Thomas's face was flushed with whiskey and pride when he spotted her. "There you are!" He pulled her roughly to his side. "Mother was asking for you. We need to discuss wedding plans. She's thinking a Christmas wedding would be perfect. Give us time to order everything from back east." Margaret nodded, playing her part again, but her thoughts drifted back to the quiet stable and the gentle understanding in Will Harper's eyes, as Thomas led her from group to group, showing off his prize. She began to understand that the diamond on her finger wasn't a gift at all. It was a shackle, beautiful and cold, and the whole town's envy was just another bar in the cage being built around her. The sunset painted the western sky in shades of crimson and gold, transforming the harsh landscape into something almost beautiful. Margaret had discovered that this hour, when the day's heat finally broke and the evening crickets began their symphony, was when Cedar Ridge revealed its hidden grace. The red cliffs caught the dying light like embers, and even the stubby sagebrush seemed to glow with an inner fire. She'd taken to walking during this time, always ending up at the stables despite her intentions to go elsewhere. It had been 3 weeks since the engagement announcement, 3 weeks of wedding preparations and society calls that left her feeling like a stranger in her own life. "Evening, Miss Whitmore." Will Harper greeted her, not looking up from the saddle he was mending. He'd grown accustomed to her visits, though they both maintained the polite fiction that her presence was coincidental. "Good evening, Mr. Harper." She leaned against the fence post, watching him work. His hands were steady and sure, coaxing the worn leather back into usefulness. "That looks like Samuel Morrison's saddle." Will nodded. "His boy Jake brought it in. Said his PA couldn't afford a new one after." He trailed off. But Margaret knew. After the bank had foreclosed on their ranch. "Thomas says it's just business," she said quietly. "That sentiment has no place in finance." "Maybe that's the problem," Will replied, still focused on his work. "When you take the humanity out of human dealings, what's left?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, listening to the rhythmic sound of his tools against leather. The smell of the stables, hay and horses and leather oil, had become oddly comforting to her, so different from the perfumed parlors where she spent her days discussing china patterns and guest lists. "Where did you come from, Mr. Harper?" she asked suddenly. "Before Cedar Ridge." He paused in his work, and she saw something flicker across his face. Old pain, carefully managed. "Kansas, originally. My folks had a small farm outside Lawrence." "Had?" "Drought took the crops, bank took the farm." His voice was matter-of-fact, but she heard the loss beneath it. "Pa couldn't handle the shame of it. Ma followed him 6 months later. Broken heart," the doctor said. Margaret's hand went to her throat. "I'm so sorry. It was a long time ago. I was 15. He resumed working on the saddle. "Learned 2 things that year. How to survive on my own, and that there's gotta be a better way than letting banks and weather decide who lives and who dies. Is that why you came west?" He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his weathered features. "Partly. Also heard there was still room out here for a man to make something of himself through honest work. Course, I didn't count on the banks following me." They fell into companionable silence. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals rising from the cooling earth. Margaret found herself studying Will's profile in the golden light. The strong jaw, the way his brow furrowed in concentration. There was something solid about him, real in a way that Thomas's polished manner could never be. "Tell me about your dreams," she said impulsively. "If you could do anything, go anywhere, what would you choose?" He set down his tools and really looked at her then, as if seeing past the expensive dress and engagement ring to something deeper. "You really want to know?" "I do." Will stood, stretching his back, and gazed out at the vast expanse beyond the town. "There's land up north, past the territories, virgin grassland where a man could raise horses, not for rich folks' carriages, but good, honest working stock, mustangs crossed with steady breeds, horses that could help families build something real." His eyes lit up as he spoke, and Margaret found herself leaning in, caught by his passion. "I'd make it a place where folks could get a fair start. No interest payments they can't meet, no foreclosures when times get hard. Just neighbors, helping neighbors, the way it should be." "That sounds..." Margaret searched for the right word. "Free. That's exactly what it would be." He agreed. "Free and fair. A place where a man's worth isn't measured by what's in his pocket, but by what's in his character." "And would you go alone?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Will's gaze met hers. Held it. I used to think so. Lately, I've been thinking maybe there's room for someone who understands, someone who sees past the way things are to how they could be. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken possibilities. Margaret felt her heart racing, and not from the walk. She looked down at her ring, the diamond catching the last rays of sunlight, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. "I should go," she said softly. "They'll be expecting me for dinner." Of course, but neither of them moved. "Mr. Harper, Will," she corrected herself, tasting his name. "Do you believe people can change their fate?" "I believe people can choose their path," he said carefully. "The hard part is being willing to pay the price for walking it." That night, Margaret sat at the Bancroft dinner table, listening to Thomas and his father discuss their latest business ventures. The chandelier cast harsh shadows on their faces as they laughed about the simple folks who didn't understand the necessity of high interest rates. "The Morrison place will make excellent grazing land," Thomas was saying. "Once we clear out that shack they called a house, where will they go?" Margaret asked. Thomas looked at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. "What does it matter? They should have thought of that before they took out loans they couldn't repay. But their children will learn a valuable lesson about fiscal responsibility." "Mr. Bancroft interrupted. "Really, Margaret, you must stop this sentimental nonsense. You're going to be a banker's wife." She retreated into silence, pushing food around her plate while the men resumed their conversation. Through the window, she could see the stables in the distance, a small island of warmth in the gathering darkness. Over the following weeks, her evening walks became a ritual. Sometimes she and Will talked about books. He was surprisingly well read. About horses. His knowledge was encyclopedic. About the small injustices and kindnesses that made up life in Cedar Ridge. Other times they simply sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint its daily masterpiece across the sky. She learned that he sent half his meager earnings to a family in Kansas, strangers who'd taken him in after his parents died. That he could play the harmonica, coaxing melodies that made her chest ache with unnamed longing. That he saw beauty in things others overlooked, the pattern of a horse's markings, the way cottonwoods danced in the wind, the courage of desert flowers blooming against all odds. "Why do you stay here?" she asked one evening. "If you hate what the banks do, why work in a town owned by one?" "Same reason those flowers bloom in the desert," he said, nodding toward a cluster of Indian paintbrush growing by the water trough. "Sometimes you gotta bloom where you're planted, at least until you save enough to transplant yourself somewhere better. And if you never save enough, then at least you brought some beauty to a hard place while you were there." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. When had she stopped seeing beauty in anything? When had her world shrunk to wedding plans and social obligations? "I used to paint," she said suddenly. "Watercolors. My mother said it was a suitable occupation for a young lady, but I painted what I saw. The real Cedar Ridge, the tired faces, the broken fences, the dignity of people holding on despite everything. Mother burned them all, said they were too depressing for polite company." "Do you still want to paint?" "I want to do something that matters," she whispered. "I want my life to mean more than being a pretty ornament on Thomas Bancroft's arm." Will moved closer, not touching her but near enough that she could feel his warmth. "You matter, Margaret, not because of that ring or your father's store or who you're marrying. You matter because of who you are, the woman who sees injustice and wants to fight it, who finds beauty in broken things, who's brave enough to question the way things are." She turned to face him, tears flowing freely now. "I'm not brave. I'm trapped, and I don't know how to break free." "Every trapped creature has to decide," Will said gently. "Whether the cage is worth the seed they're fed, only you can make that choice." The church bell tolled the hour, and Margaret knew she had to go. But as she walked back to town, Will's words echoed in her mind. That night, she lay in her bed, turning the diamond ring on her finger and wondering if any amount of security was worth the price of her soul. Outside her window, a coyote howled at the rising moon, and Margaret felt an answering wildness stir in her chest, a longing for wide-open spaces and the freedom to choose her own path, whatever the cost. The drought came like a thief in the night, stealing moisture from the earth until the very air seemed to crack with thirst. By late July, the creek that fed Cedar Ridge had shrunk to a muddy trickle, and the surrounding rangeland had turned the color of old bones. Cattle stood listlessly in whatever shade they could find, their ribs showing through dusty hides. Margaret watched from her father's store as another family loaded their meager possessions onto a wagon. The Petersons, she'd gone to school with their daughter Mary. Now they were leaving, forced out by debts they couldn't pay when their crops failed. "Terrible shame," her father muttered, but she noticed he was already calculating how to redistribute the Petersons' outstanding store credit. Across the street, the Bancroft Bank stood like a fortress, its windows gleaming despite the dust that coated everything else. While the rest of Cedar Ridge tightened their belts and prayed for rain, the Bancrofts continued their lavish lifestyle. Just last night, Margaret had attended another elaborate dinner party where imported champagne flowed freely and talk centered on the opportunities the drought presented for acquiring land at rock-bottom prices. "Smart business is knowing when to press your advantage," Thomas had said, raising his glass in a toast. The other guests, all creditors and businessmen, had laughed and agreed. Margaret had excused herself early, claiming a headache, but instead of going home, she'd walked to the edge of town where she'd seen Will Harper and several other men working by lamplight. They were digging a new channel from the distant mountain springs, trying to bring water to the community garden that fed many of the town's poorest families. "Let me help," she'd offered, hiking up her skirts. Will had looked at her with surprise, then something deeper, respect, maybe, or recognition. "You'll ruin your dress. Then I'll ruin it for something worthwhile." She'd worked alongside them until her hands blistered and her back ached, passing buckets and moving stones. No one questioned her presence after the first few minutes. There was too much work to be done. When they finally stopped near midnight, the new channel was flowing weakly, but steadily. "It's not much," Will had said, wiping sweat from his brow. "But it might keep the garden alive a few weeks longer." Now, watching the Petersons leave, Margaret felt a hot anger rise in her chest. She walked into the street, approaching their wagon. "Mary," she called. Her former classmate looked down, eyes red with tears and shame. "We'll send money when we can," Mary said quickly. "For what we owe the store." "Take this." Margaret pressed a small purse into Mary's hand. It contained most of her personal savings. "It's not a loan. It's what friends do." Mary began to cry harder. "Margaret, I can't." "You can and you will. Write to me when you get settled." As the wagon rolled away, Margaret became aware of Thomas standing behind her, his face dark with displeasure. "What did you just do?" he demanded. "I helped a friend. You gave away money to people who've proven they can't manage their finances. That's not help. That's enabling weakness." Margaret turned to face him fully. "Is that what you call it? Weakness? They lost everything to the drought. Thomas, how is that weakness?" "Because they didn't plan for it," he said, as if explaining to a child. "Father and I have been preparing for this drought for 2 years, buying up water rights, storing capital. That's the difference between success and failure. Foresight." "You mean you've been hoping for this drought?" Margaret said slowly, the full horror of it dawning on her. "You wanted this to happen." "Want has nothing to do with it. We simply positioned ourselves to benefit from inevitable circumstances." He gripped her arm. "And as my future wife, you'll benefit too. But not if you keep throwing money away on lost causes." She yanked her arm free. "Those are people, Thomas, our neighbors. They're bad investments." His voice turned cold. "And if I see you giving away any more money that will soon be mine to manage, there will be consequences." That evening, Margaret found Will at the stables, tending to a horse that had collapsed from heat exhaustion. The animal belonged to the widow Martinez, who used it to deliver laundry, her only source of income since her husband died in a mining accident. Will she make it? Margaret asked softly. Will didn't look up from his work, carefully administering water and cooling cloths. Maybe, if she rests and gets enough water, but Mrs. Martinez can't afford to let her rest. She needs the income. I could— No. Will's voice was firm. You've done enough. Thomas Bancroft's already asking questions about your charitable activities. Margaret knelt beside him, helping to support the horse's head. I don't care what Thomas thinks. You should. Men like him don't take kindly to defiance, especially from women they consider their property. I'm not his property. That ring on your finger says otherwise. Margaret looked down at the diamond, its facets catching the lantern light. I hate it, she whispered. I hate what it represents. I hate that people are suffering while that bank sits on wealth it hoards like a dragon. Will's hands stilled in their work. Dragons can be slain. In fairy tales. In real life, too. Just takes more planning. He resumed tending the horse. Jim Morrison and some of the other ranchers have been talking. There might be ways to organize, to create our own water cooperative, our own lending system. Cut the bank out entirely. Thomas would never allow it. Thomas doesn't own the whole territory. Not yet. Will met her eyes. But we'd need someone who understands how the bank operates. Someone who could help us set up alternatives. Margaret's heart began to race. I could learn. I've been listening to their dinner conversations for months. I know more about their business than Thomas realizes. It would be dangerous if they found out you were helping. What's the worst they could do? Force me to marry him? She laughed bitterly. They're already doing that. The horse stirred, whinnying softly, and they both turned their attention back to her care. As they worked together in the lamplight, Margaret felt something shift inside her. The anger that had been building for weeks crystallized into determination. Over the following days, she began paying closer attention to the conversations around her. She memorized interest rates, learned about water rights law from the documents Thomas carelessly left on his desk. She made careful notes, which she hid in her watercolor box, the one thing her mother never touched. At night, she shared what she learned with Will, who passed it on to the growing network of families looking for alternatives to the Bancroft stranglehold. They met in secret, in barns and back rooms, planning a different future for Cedar Ridge. The breaking point came when Thomas announced his latest scheme at a town meeting. Given the current water crisis, he said, standing at the podium like a benevolent king, the bank will be offering special drought loans at only 30% interest. This will allow families to purchase water and supplies until the rains return. 30%, someone shouted. That's robbery. It's business, Thomas replied smoothly. The risk requires appropriate compensation. Of course, those who can't afford the terms are welcome to seek opportunities elsewhere. Margaret watched faces in the crowd crumble. 30% interest would destroy what little remained of their finances. It wasn't help, it was a death sentence delivered with a smile. That night, she made her decision. While the town slept, she crept to her father's store and unlocked the back door. Will was waiting with Jim Morrison and several others. You're sure about this? Will asked. I've never been more sure of anything. She led them to the storeroom. Take what you need for the families who can't afford food. I'll alter the books to hide the loss. Margaret, if they catch you, then I'll face the consequences, but I won't stand by and watch children go hungry while the Bancrofts throw parties. They worked quickly and quietly, loading sacks of flour, beans, and other staples. As dawn approached, wagons headed out to the poorest families in the county, delivering hope along with sustenance. Margaret returned to her room just as the sun crested the mountains, her heart pounding but her conscience clear. She looked at herself in the mirror, disheveled, dirt under her fingernails, her fine nightgown torn. She'd never felt more like herself. When Thomas came calling that afternoon, full of plans for their wedding, she listened with half an ear while mentally calculating how much food they could distribute before someone noticed. She smiled and nodded. playing the dutiful fiancé, all while planning the next act of rebellion. "You seem distracted, my dear," Thomas observed. "Just the heat." She replied, "It makes everyone a bit addled, don't you think?" "Indeed. Father thinks it might break soon. Bad for business if it does. We've got several more properties lined up for foreclosure." Margaret's smile never wavered, but inside, her resolve hardened like steel in a forge. The drought would end eventually, but the real work of bringing justice to Cedar Ridge had just begun. The storm announced itself with a wall of dust that turned day into night. Margaret had seen plenty of desert storms, but this one felt different, charged with an electricity that made the hair on her arms stand up. She hurried toward the stables as the first fat raindrops began to fall, knowing instinctively that Will would be there, securing the horses. Thunder cracked overhead like God's own whip, and suddenly the sky opened. Rain fell in sheets so thick she could barely see 3 feet ahead. By the time she stumbled through the stable doors, she was soaked through, her dress clinging to her skin, hair plastered to her face. "Margaret!" Will caught her as she nearly fell, his hands warm against her cold arms. "What are you doing out in this?" She was shaking, though not entirely from the cold. The weight of the past weeks, the secret meetings, the stolen supplies, the constant fear of discovery, had finally caught up with her. I needed... Hey. His voice was soft as he guided her to a hay bale. "It's all right. You're safe here." Lightning illuminated the stable in stark white flashes, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very earth. The horses whinnied nervously, and Will moved between them, murmuring soothing words. Margaret watched him work. This man who could calm frightened beasts with just his presence. "Thomas knows," she said suddenly. The words tumbled out like the rain. "About the missing supplies. He was questioning Father all through dinner. He suspects me." Will's hand stilled on the horse he was tending. "Are you certain?" "He kept watching me, making comments about loyalty and trust. Then he mentioned that after we're married, he'll be taking a more active role in the store's operations." She laughed bitterly. "To ensure proper management," he said. Will crossed to her in 2 strides, kneeling so they were eye level. "We knew this might happen. Jim Morrison says his cousin in Colorado. I don't want to run." The words surprised her as much as him. "This is my home." "These are my people. Why should I be the one to leave?" Thunder crashed again, closer this time. The stable doors rattled in their frames. Will's face was serious in the lamplight, shadows playing across his features. "Because Thomas Bancroft destroys what he can't control," Will said quietly. "And you, Margaret Whitmore, are magnificently uncontrollable." She looked at him then, really looked at him. Rain had darkened his hair, and his shirt was damp from helping her. There was concern in his eyes. Yes, but something else too, something that made her chest tight and her breathing shallow. "Will," she whispered. He shook his head, starting to pull back, but she caught his hand. It was rough with calluses, nothing like Thomas's smooth banker's hands. It was the hand of a man who worked, who built, who knew the value of things beyond their price. "Don't," he said, but his voice was rough. "You're engaged. You're trapped," she finished. "Except when I'm here, with you." The storm raged outside, but in the stable, there was only the sound of their breathing and the soft movements of the horses. Will's thumb traced circles on her palm, and that simple touch sent fire through her veins. "Do you know what you're saying?" he asked. "I'm saying that this," she gestured to the space between them. "This is the only real thing in my life. Everything else is performance, pretense, but here, with you, I remember who I am. Margaret, I watch you work," she continued, the words pouring out like the rain. "The way you treat every creature with respect, the way you give even when you have almost nothing, the way you see possibility where others see only problems, you make me want to be brave." Will's free hand came up to cup her face, his touch infinitely gentle. "You are brave, braver than anyone I know." Then why am I so scared? Because you're smart enough to know the cost of what you're feeling. His forehead touched hers. We both are. The thunder rolled again, but Margaret barely heard it. All she knew was Will's warmth, the solid presence of him, the feeling that here, in this moment, she was exactly where she belonged. The night you arrived, she said softly. At the engagement party. You said forcing things doesn't end well for anyone. I remember. You were right. Everything about my life with Thomas is forced. But this, she lifted their joined hands, this is as natural as breathing, and as dangerous as this storm, Will added. But he didn't let go. I don't care about danger anymore. I care about truth. And the truth is, she took a shuddering breath. The truth is that I'm falling in love with you. Will Harper, God help me, but I am. He closed his eyes as if in pain. You can't. We can't. The things they do to you, to your family, are worse than living a lie for the rest of my life. Worse than watching Thomas turn me into another one of his possessions, displayed and polished, but never truly seen. But the stable boy gave her nights no jewel could match, Will murmured, so quietly she almost missed it. What? He smiled sadly. Something I thought when I saw you that first night, covered in diamonds but looking like a bird in a cage. I thought, what good is all that finery if it doesn't bring joy? Margaret felt tears mixing with the rainwater still on her cheeks. Then you understand. These nights, these stolen moments, they're worth more to me than all the security Thomas could offer. Understanding and acting on it are different things, Will said. But his resolve was weakening. She could see it in the way he leaned closer, the way his hand trembled against her cheek. Then help me understand, she challenged. Tell me you feel nothing. Tell me these weeks have meant nothing. Tell me to go back to Thomas and forget. He silenced her with a kiss, soft and desperate and full of everything they couldn't say. Margaret's world narrowed to this, Will's lips on hers, his arms pulling her close. The feeling of coming home to a place she'd never known existed. When they broke apart, both breathing hard. The storm had begun to ease. Rain still fell, but gentler now, like tears of relief after a long-held sob. This changes everything, Will said. Yes, Margaret agreed. It does. They held each other in the lamplight while the storm moved on, leaving the desert washed clean and new. Margaret knew morning would bring consequences, decisions, possibly disaster. But right now, wrapped in Will's arms with the honest scent of hay and rain surrounding them, she felt more herself than she had in years. What do we do now? Will asked. Now? Margaret pulled back to look at him, memorizing every line of his face. Now we be honest, with ourselves, if no one else. We stop pretending that what's between us can be ignored or wished away. And Thomas? I'll break the engagement. The words came out steady, certain. I'll face whatever comes, but I won't marry him. Not when I know what real love feels like. Will's arms tightened around her. He won't let you go easily. Men like him, they don't accept losing. Then we'll face that together, if you're willing. He answered by kissing her again, deeper this time, full of promise and protection and the wild hope of two people choosing love over safety. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving crystal clear air and the sweet smell of rain on sage. Inside the stable, Margaret and Will held each other and began to plan a future neither of them could fully see, but both were willing to fight for. The diamond ring on her finger caught the lamplight one last time before she pulled it off, setting it on the hay bale beside them. It sat there, glittering and cold, while she turned back to Will's warm embrace, choosing flesh and blood and honest love over all the jewels in the world. The whispers started like tumbleweeds, rolling through Cedar Ridge on every passing breeze. Mrs. Patterson mentioned to Mrs. Henley that she'd seen the Whitmore girl heading toward the stables after dark. Mrs. Henley told her husband, who mentioned it at the saloon. By week's end, the whole town was buzzing with speculation. Margaret felt the weight of their stares as she walked down Main Street. Conversations stopped when she passed. resuming in hushed tones once they thought she was out of earshot. Even in her father's store, customers who'd known her since childhood now watched her with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. "Margaret," her mother's voice was sharp as a whip crack. "Come into the parlor, now." The parlor curtains were drawn despite the afternoon heat. Her mother sat rigid in her best chair, while her father paced by the fireplace. The air felt thick with unspoken accusations. "Sit," her mother commanded. Margaret remained standing. "If you have something to say, say it. Don't take that tone with me. Young lady, do you have any idea what people are saying?" "I imagine they're saying many things. They always do." Her father stopped pacing. "They're saying you've been seen at the stables, at night, alone with that Harper boy. Will Harper is a good man? He's a stable hand," her mother's composure cracked. "A drifter with nothing to his name but the clothes on his back, and you, engaged to Thomas Bancroft. An engagement I never wanted. What you want is irrelevant." Her father's voice was cold. "This family's future depends on that marriage. The store needs the Bancroft backing, especially now with the drought." "The drought Thomas is profiting from?" Margaret interrupted. "The suffering he's orchestrating." "That's business. Margaret, you're too emotional to understand. I understand perfectly." She felt her anger rising like floodwater. "I understand that you're willing to sell your daughter to secure your profits, that you care more about the store's ledgers than your neighbors' lives." Her mother stood abruptly. "How dare you? How dare I? How dare you? Pushing me toward a man who sees me as property, who plans to inventory me like one of father's shipments. Thomas Bancroft is offering you security, status, prison." Margaret's voice was flat. "He's offering me a prettily decorated prison, and you're holding the door open. If you think that stable boy can offer you better," her father began. "His name is Will, and yes, he offers me better. He offers me respect, partnership, the chance to be myself instead of a porcelain doll on a shelf. Romance." Her mother spat the word like a curse. "You think romance will feed you when winter comes? Will keep a roof over your head? You foolish, foolish girl. If being foolish means choosing love over ledgers, then yes, I'm foolish. Then you're no daughter of mine." Her mother's words fell like stones. "If you continue this shameful behavior, you'll leave this house." Margaret felt the ultimatum settle over her like a shroud. She looked at her parents, these people who'd raised her but never really seen her, and made her choice. "Then I'll pack my things." She turned to leave, but her father's voice stopped her. "Margaret, think, without our support, without the Bancroft connection, you'll have nothing. You'll be just another fallen woman, scorned by decent society." "Decent society?" Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The same decent society that watches families starve while hoarding grain? That calls debt collection good business and compassion weakness? If that's decency, I want no part of it." That evening, Thomas arrived unannounced. Margaret heard his voice in the parlor, low and threatening, though she couldn't make out the words. When her mother came to fetch her, her face was pale. "He wants to speak with you, alone." Margaret found Thomas standing by the window, his silhouette dark against the fading light. He didn't turn when she entered. "I've been patient," he said quietly. "More patient than most men would be. I overlooked your charity work, your inappropriate friendships, even your obvious reluctance about our engagement. I thought you'd come to your senses. Thomas, but this," he turned, and she saw cold fury in his eyes. "Carrying on with a stable hand, making a fool of me in front of the entire town. I never meant—" "What you meant is irrelevant." He crossed to her in 2 strides, gripping her shoulders. "What matters is what people see. And what they see is my fiancé behaving like a common—" "Choose your next word very carefully," Margaret warned, surprised by the steel in her own voice. His grip tightened. "You think you have power here? You think that boy can protect you? I could destroy him with a word. One accusation of theft, one suggestion of impropriety with the horses. You wouldn't. Wouldn't I? His type drifts into town, causes trouble, drifts out again. Who'd miss him? Who'd even question it? Margaret felt ice in her veins. If you hurt him, then be smart. His voice dropped to a whisper. End this foolishness. Publicly. Make it clear you were temporarily confused, perhaps overwrought from the wedding preparations. I'll forgive this lapse, and we'll move forward. And if I refuse, then you'll learn what it means to cross a Bancroft. Your father's store needs our bank's credit line. Your mother enjoys her social position. Your stable boy needs his job and his freedom. Amazing how fragile all these things are. Margaret stared at him, seeing clearly for the first time the monster beneath the polished surface. You're threatening everyone I care about. I'm explaining reality. The choice is yours. Be smart or be destroyed. You have until tomorrow night to decide. After he left, Margaret sat in the gathering darkness, her mind racing. She thought of Will, of her parents, of all the family struggling under the Bancroft stranglehold. Thomas was right about one thing. He had the power to destroy them all. But power, she was learning, came in many forms. Near midnight, she slipped out of the house with just a small bag. Will was waiting at the stables, having received her urgent message. When she told him about Thomas's threats, his face darkened. We're leaving, he said immediately. Tonight, Jim Morrison's cousin in Colorado. No, Margaret's voice was firm. I won't run, and I won't let him hurt you or anyone else. Margaret, you don't understand what men like him are capable of. Yes, I do. That's why we need to be smarter. She took his hands. I have an idea, but it's dangerous. For both of us. Tell me. Thomas is right that he has power, but his power comes from secrets, the real books he keeps, the water rights he's stolen, the bribes he's paid. What if those secrets were exposed? Will's eyes widened. You know where he keeps them? In his study, behind a false panel I discovered weeks ago when I was there for tea. If we could get those documents to the federal marshal in Tucson, breaking into the Bancroft house. Margaret, that's necessary. She finished. He threatened you. Will threatened my family, the whole town. Sometimes the only way to fight a bully is to show you're not afraid. Will was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the lamplight. You're not the same woman who stood in this stable 3 months ago. No, she agreed. That woman was sleepwalking through life. You woke me up. Then I'll stand with you, he said simply. Whatever comes. They spent the remaining hours until dawn planning. It would have to be tomorrow night, during the monthly poker game Thomas hosted, when the house would be full of drunk businessmen and the study likely empty. As the first light touched the mountains, Margaret prepared to return home for what might be the last time. Will caught her hand. Whatever happens tomorrow, he said, I want you to know, these weeks with you have been worth whatever price I have to pay. Don't talk like that, she whispered. We're going to succeed. We're going to free this town and build that horse ranch up north, and he silenced her with a kiss, gentle and full of unspoken fears. When they parted, Margaret saw her own determination reflected in his eyes. Together, he asked. Together, she confirmed, as she walked back through the awakening town. Margaret felt the weight of every stare, heard every whisper. Let them talk, she thought. By tomorrow night, they'd have something far more substantial to discuss than her evening walks. The stable boy had given her more than nights no jewel could match. He'd given her courage, purpose, and the strength to fight for what was right. Now it was time to use them all. The tension in Cedar Ridge had been building like water behind a dam, and on that sweltering August night, the dam finally burst. It started at the Garrison farm, where Sheriff Coleman and 2 bank representatives arrived to serve foreclosure papers. Old Pete Garrison, who'd worked that land for 30 years, stood on his porch with his rifle. This ain't right, he said, his voice carrying across the dusty yard. I missed 2 payments because of the drought, 2 payments in 30 years. The law is the law, Sheriff Coleman replied, though he looked uncomfortable. Mr. Bancroft has been more than patient. Patient? Pete's son Jake stepped out beside his father. They raised our interest rate 3 times this year. No man could keep up with that. Word spread fast in a town like Cedar Ridge. By sunset, dozens of families had gathered at the Garrison farm. Will was among them, having spent the day helping organize what everyone hoped would be a peaceful protest. Margaret watched from her bedroom window as more people headed toward the edge of town. She could see torches beginning to light up the gathering darkness. Her parents were at the Bancroft house for Thomas's poker evening, the very event she and Will had planned to use for their own purposes. But now, with half the town ready to explode, a rock shattered the bank window on Main Street. That was all it took. Years of pent-up fury erupted as the crowd surged into town. Margaret ran downstairs, her heart pounding. She had to find Will, had to help somehow. The scene on Main Street was chaos. Men who'd lost their farms faced off against the sheriff's hastily assembled deputies. Women who'd watched their children go hungry stood shoulder to shoulder with their husbands. And in the middle of it all, Thomas Bancroft emerged from his house, pistol in hand. "Disperse immediately!" he shouted. "This is an illegal assembly." "Illegal?" Jim Morrison pushed to the front of the crowd. "Like stealing water rights through forged documents? Like charging interest rates that violate territorial law?" Thomas's face went pale. "You have no proof." "Actually, we do." Margaret stepped forward, and the crowd parted for her. In her hands were the documents she and Will had managed to retrieve just an hour earlier, not through breaking in, but because Thomas's own housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, whose grandson had gone hungry while the Bancrofts feasted, had unlocked the study door for them. "Contracts with forged signatures," Margaret announced, her voice carrying clear and strong. "Letters detailing bribes to the Territorial Water Commission. Books showing the real interest rates charged versus what was reported. You little—" Thomas raised his pistol toward her. The shot came from behind Thomas, not at Margaret, but into the air, a warning that made everyone freeze. "Mr." Bancroft Sr. stood on his porch, smoking rifle in hand. "Enough," the elder Bancroft roared. "You want blood? Come and take it. But know this, we own the law in this town. We own the judges. You think some stolen papers will matter? Maybe not in Cedar Ridge," Will said, stepping up beside Margaret. "But the federal marshal in Tucson might see things differently, especially since we sent copies of everything 3 hours ago." The lie came smooth and confident. They'd had no time to send anything, but the Bancrofts didn't know that. "You're bluffing," Thomas snarled. "Are we?" Margaret held his gaze. "Do you really want to find out?" The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Deputies fingered their weapons nervously. The crowd pressed closer, anger making them brave. One spark would set the whole thing ablaze. Then Sarah Morrison pushed through the crowd, her baby in her arms. "Look at him," she said, holding up her infant son. "Look at what your greed has done. He's sick because we couldn't afford the medicine. The Hendricks girl died last week because her family chose food over doctor bills. How many more children have to suffer for your profits? Business requires sacrifice." "Mr. Bancroft began. "Your sacrifice or ours?" Pete Garrison interrupted. "Because I don't see you going hungry. I don't see your children sick. I see you getting fat off our misery." The crowd surged forward. A deputy fired into the air. Women screamed. Men shouted. And in that moment of chaos, Thomas made his move. He grabbed Margaret, pressing his pistol to her side. "Everyone back, now!" Will started forward, but Margaret caught his eye, shaking her head slightly. She could feel Thomas trembling against her, not with fear, but with rage. "You ruined everything," he hissed in her ear. "You could have had it all. I never wanted your all." She replied calmly, "I wanted truth, justice, love." "Love?" He laughed bitterly. "With a stable boy? You threw away respectability for that? I threw away chains for freedom." The crowd had gone silent, watching. Sheriff Coleman stepped forward carefully. "Now, Mr. Bancroft, let's not do anything rash." "Rash?" Thomas's voice cracked. "They're trying to destroy everything my family built." "No," Will said quietly. We're trying to save what your family is destroying. This town, these people. The very idea that folks can work hard and build something without having it stolen by those with power. Pretty words from a nobody. Thomas spat. Maybe, Will agreed. But I'd rather be a nobody with a clear conscience than a somebody built on others' suffering. Margaret felt Thomas's grip loosen slightly. His attention focused on Will. It was enough. She twisted suddenly, driving her elbow into his ribs. The gun went off, the bullet flying wild into the night sky. Thomas stumbled back, and suddenly the crowd was on him. Not with violence, but with the simple weight of numbers, disarming him before he could react. "It's over," Margaret said, looking at both Bancrofts. "Your reign of fear, of greed. It ends tonight. You think you've won?" Mr. Bancroft's voice was cold. "We have connections, resources. We'll bury you in legal proceedings. Try it." Jim Morrison stepped forward. "But know that we've organized 2 families across 3 counties, all ready to testify about your practices. The territorial governor's already asking questions. Your political friends won't risk their own necks for you." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but then Mrs. Davies stepped out of the Bancroft house. The elderly housekeeper walked slowly but deliberately to Margaret's side. "I've worked for this family 20 years, she announced. "Kept their secrets, cleaned up their messes. No more." She handed Margaret another bundle of papers. "These are the real books, the ones showing where the bribe money went, which officials were bought, everything." Thomas lunged forward, but the crowd held him back. His face was twisted with fury and something else, fear, finally, real fear. "You're all fools," he shouted. "Without us, this town will dry up and blow away. We're the only thing keeping Cedar Ridge alive." "No," Margaret said firmly. "You're the parasite that's been draining its life. Cedar Ridge survived before the Bancrofts, and it'll survive after." Sheriff Coleman, who'd been silent through most of the confrontation, finally spoke. I think it's time for the Bancrofts to leave Cedar Ridge, for their own safety." "You can't exile us," Mr. Bancroft protested. "We have rights." "You have until dawn," Coleman said quietly. "After that, I can't guarantee your protection, not after what I've seen in these documents." The crowd began to disperse slowly, the energy draining away now that the confrontation was over. Families drifted back to their homes, but there was something different in their bearing. Heads held higher, backs straighter. Hope, fragile but real, had taken root. Margaret found herself standing with Will in the middle of the now empty street. Her dress was torn, her hair wild, her hands still trembling from the confrontation, but she felt more alive than she ever had. "We did it," Will said softly, wonder in his voice. "We started it," Margaret corrected. "The real work comes now, rebuilding, creating something better. Together?" She took his hand, feeling the calluses and strength there. Together. As dawn broke over Cedar Ridge, 2 things happened simultaneously. The Bancroft carriages rolled out of town, loaded with whatever they could carry, Thomas staring back with undisguised hatred, and in the stable where it all began. Margaret Whitmore and Will Harper stood before Judge McKinnon, one of the few honest officials in the territory, and exchanged vows with half the town as witnesses. She wore her mother's simple wedding dress, cleaned and pressed by Mrs. Davies. He wore his best shirt, donated by Jim Morrison. There were no diamonds, no elaborate flowers, no champagne from back east. But as Will slipped a simple silver band on her finger, made by the local blacksmith from a melted-down horseshoe for luck, Margaret knew she had something worth more than all the jewels the Bancrofts could buy. She had love. She had community. She had freedom. And as the sun rose fully, painting the desert in shades of gold and promise, she had the beginning of a new life built not on greed and fear, but on justice, partnership, and hope. The stable boy had indeed given her nights no jewel could match. But more than that, he'd given her the courage to fight for days worth living. The morning after the confrontation dawned eerily quiet. Main Street bore the scars of the night's chaos. Broken glass glittered in the early light. Overturned crates littered the thoroughfare, and the bank's shattered windows stared like hollow eyes. But it was the Whitmore house that drew the most attention, its front door hanging open like a wound. Margaret stood in what had been her childhood bedroom, surveying the damage. Every drawer had been ransacked, every precious memory scrutinized and discarded. Her mother sat on the bed, holding a torn photograph of Margaret as a child. "They came at dawn," her mother whispered. "Your father tried to stop them, but—" Samuel Whitmore appeared in the doorway, a purple bruise spreading across his jaw. "Thomas Bancroft might be gone, but his influence isn't. Judge Harrington, the one from Prescott, says our marriage to Will isn't legal, says no proper witnesses were present, that Judge McKinnon overstepped his authority. They're trying to destroy us," Margaret's mother continued, her voice hollow. "The suppliers won't deliver to the store. The remaining bank board is calling in our loans. They mean to starve us out." Margaret knelt beside her mother, taking her cold hands. "I'm sorry. I never meant for you to suffer for my choices." Her mother's eyes, when they met hers, held a complexity of emotions. "I was wrong," she said quietly. "About Will, about what matters. I saw him during the fight, saw how he tried to protect everyone, not just you. That's what a real man does." "It doesn't matter now," Samuel said bitterly. "We'll lose everything." "No," Margaret stood, steel in her voice. "We'll leave. Together. All of us. Leave." Her father's voice cracked. "This store is my life's work." "Your life's work is your family," Margaret interrupted. "And there's opportunity elsewhere. Will and I have been planning. There's land up north, past the territories. Clean land, free from the Bancrofts' poison." Will appeared in the doorway then, dust-covered from helping other families salvage what they could. "The Morrisons are coming with us. The Hendricks, too. Pete Garrison says he knows the trail. Used to drive cattle through those parts." "A wagon train?" Samuel laughed, but it was edged with hysteria. "Like the old days. We're not pioneers. Margaret, we're shopkeepers." "We're survivors," Will corrected gently. "And sometimes surviving means knowing when to start over." Margaret watched her parents wrestle with the idea. Her mother's fingers traced the torn photograph, while her father stared at the ruined room that represented everything he'd built. "The federal marshal never received those documents," her father said finally. "Thomas made sure of that. He has friends everywhere. Then we make new friends." Margaret said, "Build a new town, one where justice means something more than who has the deepest pockets." "You're talking about fantasy," her mother said, but there was something in her voice, not dismissal, but a fragile hope. "I'm talking about freedom," Margaret replied. "The real kind, not just from the Bancrofts, but from the system that created them." Over the following days, what started as a desperate escape plan transformed into something larger. Word spread through the poorest quarters of Cedar Ridge, through the tent camps of displaced farmers, through the network of families the Bancrofts had destroyed. A new beginning, a chance to build something better. They gathered at the Morrison farm to plan. The barn was packed with people. Some Margaret knew well. Others were strangers united by common purpose. Will stood before them, a map spread on a makeshift table. "The journey will take at least 6 weeks," he explained. "Through desert, then mountains. It won't be easy. We'll need every skill, every strong back, every bit of courage we can muster." "What about Indian territories?" someone called out. "They won't take kindly to more settlers." "I've been corresponding with a missionary up north," Judge McKinnon said. He'd decided to join them, tired of fighting corruption in a system designed to perpetuate it. "The local tribes are peaceful, more interested in trade than conflict. If we approach with respect, offer fair dealings." "Fair dealings," Pete Garrison snorted. "That'll be a change." "That's exactly the point." Margaret stepped forward. "Everything will be a change. No banks charging criminal interest. No water rights stolen through forged documents. No children going hungry while others feast." Pretty words. A woman in the back called out, "But who'll lead? Who'll make the hard decisions? We all will, Will said. That's what a real community does. Share the work, share the decisions, share the rewards, and share the risks. Samuel Whitmore added. He'd been quiet through most of the meeting, but now he stood. My daughter and her husband are right. I've spent 20 years trying to succeed in a rigged game. Maybe it's time to help create a fair one. The room stirred with energy, fear mixing with hope, uncertainty with determination. These weren't seasoned pioneers, but desperate people choosing an uncertain future over a crushing present. Margaret's mother stood slowly. I haven't cooked over an open fire in 20 years, she announced. But I did once, when Samuel and I were first married, before we got comfortable, before we forgot what really mattered. She looked at Margaret. I'll need to learn again. We all will. One by one, families committed. The Davidsons, who'd lost their mill. The Kowalskis, whose daughter needed medicine the local doctor wouldn't provide without payment up front. Old Chen, who'd been refused service at the bank because of his race. Mrs. Davies, the Bancroft's former housekeeper, who knew loyalty meant more than wages. When do we leave? Jim Morrison asked. 4 days, Will replied. Enough time to gather supplies. Not enough for our enemies to organize more obstacles. The meeting broke up with people talking excitedly. Planning, organizing. Margaret found herself outside with Will, looking up at the vast desert sky. Are we doing the right thing? She asked softly. Are we doing a thing that needs doing? He countered. That's the better question. People will suffer on the journey. Some might die. People are suffering and dying here, Will pointed out. At least on the trail. They'll be moving towards something better instead of slowly being crushed by something worse. Margaret leaned into him, drawing strength from his solid presence. When I first met you, I never imagined that you'd become a revolutionary, he teased gently. That I'd become myself, she corrected. The person I was always meant to be, if I'd just had the courage to look. You had the courage? It was just buried under expectations and fear. He kissed the top of her head. Like water in the desert. Sometimes you have to dig deep, but it's always there. The next days passed in a blur of preparation. Wagons were repaired, supplies gathered, routes planned. The remaining town authorities made half-hearted attempts to stop them. Legal injunctions that Judge McKinnon deftly countered. Suppliers pressured not to sell to them circumvented by midnight transactions. Margaret stood in the empty store one last time, remembering the little girl who'd played between these shelves, dreaming of adventure. She'd found it, though not in the way she'd imagined. No regrets, her father asked, joining her. None, she said firmly. This place was never really ours. We were just managing it for the Bancrofts, even if we didn't realize it. And now we build something that is ours, all of ours. He nodded slowly. Your mother and I, we're proud of you, scared, angry sometimes, but proud. You did what we never had the courage to do. We're doing it together. Margaret reminded him. That's what matters. On the final night, Thomas Bancroft returned. He appeared at the stable like a ghost, his fine clothes replaced with trail gear, a gun at his hip. Margaret, checking the horses one last time, froze when she saw him. You destroyed everything, he said, his voice strangely calm. We revealed everything, she corrected, hand moving to the knife at her belt. Will had insisted she carry it. Same result. He stepped closer, and she could see the wild look in his eyes. My father's in prison. Our accounts are frozen. The family name is ruined. Actions have consequences. Yes, he agreed. They do. He drew his gun, but Will was already there, tackling Thomas from the side. They rolled in the dust, fighting for the weapon. Margaret heard the shot, saw the flash, smelled the powder. Will stood slowly, blood on his shirt. But it was Thomas who lay still, his own bullet finding an unintended target in the struggle. Will! Margaret rushed to him, hands searching for the wound. It's not mine, he said shakily. The blood. It's not mine. They stared at Thomas's still form. Young, handsome, privileged Thomas, whose greed had cost him everything, including his life. "We have to tell the sheriff." Margaret said, "No." Judge McKinnon emerged from the shadows, several others with him. "We saw everything, self-defense, clear as day, and frankly, one less problem for the journey." They buried Thomas Bancroft at the edge of town. No marker, no ceremony. Another casualty of the old ways dying hard. Dawn came with a caravan assembled, 37 wagons, over 100 souls, all looking north toward hope. Margaret sat beside Will on their wagon seat, her parents in the bed behind them with what they'd salvaged from the store. "Ready?" Will asked, taking up the reins. Margaret looked back once at Cedar Ridge, at the bank with its broken windows, the store with its empty shelves, the big house on the hill where the Bancrofts had ruled like kings. Then she faced forward, toward the unknown trail and the promise of something better. "Ready," she said. Will clicked to the horses, and they began to move, one by one. The wagons followed, wheels creaking, children crying, dogs barking, the sound of a community in motion, leaving the past behind and rolling toward a future they would build with their own hands. The diamond ring, Margaret realized, was still back there somewhere, in the stable where she'd left it that night of the storm, or perhaps taken by Thomas in his final desperate visit. It didn't matter. She had something far more precious: freedom, purpose, and love. The stable boy had given her nights no jewel could match. But more than that, he'd given her the courage to chase days worth living, no matter how far the trail might lead. The desert stretched endlessly before them, a sea of red sand and stubborn sage that seemed to mock their passage. By the third week, the initial excitement of escape had given way to the grinding reality of survival. Water was scarce, rationed drop by precious drop. The sun was merciless, turning wagon beds into ovens and making each step an effort of will. Margaret walked beside their wagon to spare the oxen, her boots worn thin, her once soft hands now cracked and bleeding, but she walked with purpose, checking on families, helping where she could. She'd learned to start fires with buffalo chips, to read the sky for signs of water, to stretch a handful of flour into a meal that could feed 6. "Mrs. Harper!" Young Lucy Kowalski ran up, her face flushed with more than heat. "My ma's baby is coming." Margaret grabbed the medical supplies they'd salvaged and rushed to the Kowalski wagon. Anna Kowalski lay in the back, her face twisted with pain. This was her 5th child, but the firstborn on the trail, a dangerous proposition even under the best circumstances. "How long?" Margaret asked, rolling up her sleeves. "Since dawn," Anna gasped. "Something's wrong. It doesn't feel like the others." Margaret had helped with births back in Cedar Ridge, but always as an assistant to the doctor. Now she was all they had. "Mrs. Davies," she called. The elderly woman appeared immediately, understanding without explanation. Together they worked through the afternoon, the wagon train halting despite the need to make miles. Will organized the men to create shade structures while women brought what little water could be spared. The community that had been forged in desperation was being tempered by hardship into something stronger. The baby came at sunset, a tiny girl who barely cried, her breath shallow and labored. Margaret held the infant, willing her to live, while Anna wept with exhaustion and fear. "She needs more than we have," Mrs. Davies said quietly. "Then we'll give her everything we have." Margaret replied. She thought of all the useless things she'd once valued: silk dresses, jewelry, social position, and how gladly she'd trade them all for the knowledge to save this child. Through the night, they kept vigil. Will brought a goat they'd bought from a Mexican trader, its milk the baby's only hope for nourishment. Judge McKinnon, surprising everyone, revealed he'd once studied medicine before law and guided them through keeping the baby warm and breathing. When dawn broke and the baby still lived, a quiet celebration rippled through the camp. Small victories were all they had, but they cherished each one. The mountain pass nearly broke them. Pete Garrison had warned it would be hard, but nothing prepared them for the reality. The trail, such as it was, wound up impossible grades where wagons had to be emptied and hauled by rope, their contents carried on already exhausted backs. They lost 2 wagons to gravity's cruel pull, watching helplessly as precious supplies tumbled into ravines too deep to reach. But no lives were lost, and in their new arithmetic, that counted as victory. "Look," Will said one evening, pointing ahead. Margaret shaded her eyes and gasped. Below them spread a valley unlike anything in their desert homeland, green with real grass, split by a river that ran clear and strong. Trees lined the banks, actual trees, not the stunted things that passed for them in Cedar Ridge. "Is that it?" her mother asked, hope naked in her voice. "Part of it," Will confirmed. "According to Pete's maps, the best land is another day north, but this is what we're looking for." They descended into the valley like pilgrims reaching a shrine. Children who'd been listless with heat exhaustion ran laughing into the river. Men and women who'd barely spoken from exhaustion sat together, planning where to build, where to plant, where to create the community they'd dreamed of. Margaret found herself standing knee-deep in the river, letting the cold water wash away weeks of dust and fear. Will joined her, taking her hand. "We made it," he said, wonder in his voice. "We've started," she corrected. "Making it will take years, generations, maybe. But we've started," he agreed. "That's what matters." They made camp by the river that night, and for the first time since leaving Cedar Ridge, there was music. Jim Morrison had kept his fiddle safe through every hardship, and now he played while others danced, not the formal dances of society balls, but the wild, free movements of people celebrating survival itself. Margaret watched her parents dancing together, looking younger than they had in years. Her mother's gray hair had escaped its pins, flowing free in the firelight. Her father's stern face was soft with something that might have been joy. "They're different," Will observed. "We all are," Margaret said. "The desert burned away everything that wasn't essential. What's left is who we really are." "And who are you, Margaret Harper?" She considered the question seriously. "I'm a woman who can birth babies and break horses, who can read ledgers and track game. I'm someone who chose love over comfort and never looked back." She smiled at him. "I'm your wife, in every way that matters, whatever the law says." "The law will catch up," Judge McKinnon said, overhearing. "I plan to establish a proper court as soon as we have buildings to hold it in. Your marriage will be the first one I make officially official." They spent 3 days by the river, recovering strength and scouting the land. The soil was rich, fed by spring floods. Game was plentiful. Deer, rabbits, wild turkey. The mountains provided timber for building and protection from the worst weather. On the 4th day, they reached their final destination, a natural bowl in the hills where the river widened into something almost like a lake. The land seemed to welcome them, as if it had been waiting for people who would tend it rather than exploit it. "Here," Will said simply. And everyone knew he was right. The work began immediately. They'd learned on the trail that shared labor made impossible things possible. While some cleared land for planting, others began cutting timber. The women organized everything from cooking arrangements to schools, because even in the wilderness, children needed learning. Margaret threw herself into every task. She helped raise the first communal building, a combination meeting hall, school, and church. She worked with Anna Kowalski to establish a garden that would provide herbs for medicine. She assisted her father in creating a trading post that would operate on principles of fairness rather than exploitation. One evening, as the first real structures began to take shape, Thomas Bancroft's words echoed in her memory. "Without us, this town will dry up and blow away." She looked around at their growing settlement, still rough, still fragile, but alive with possibility. Children played in the streets they were creating. Men and women worked side by side, building something that belonged to all of them. In the distance, Will was working with the horses, establishing the ranch that would provide stock for families throughout the territory. No, she thought, towns don't die from lack of banks or bitter men in fine suits. They die from lack of hope, lack of justice, lack of community. And those things bloomed here like wildflowers after rain. Regrets? Will asked, joining her on the hill overlooking their new home. Margaret felt for the ring finger that had once borne a diamond worth more than some families saw in a lifetime. Now it bore only a simple band and the calluses of honest work. "How can I regret finding myself?" she asked. "Finding you, finding this," as the sun set on their new home, painting the sky in shades of hope. Margaret knew that some jewels couldn't be worn on fingers or displayed in cases. Some jewels were moments. A baby's first strong cry after a night of fear. A community dancing by firelight. The look in your beloved's eyes when you face the future together. The stable boy had given her nights no jewel could match. But more than that, he'd given her the courage to help build a world where such nights were possible for everyone. Where children could grow up free from the shadow of greed. Where love mattered more than ledgers. She took Will's work-roughened hand in hers and headed down the hill toward their new life. Behind them, the last light caught on something half buried in the dust. A fragment of crystal that might once have been part of an expensive ring. Neither of them noticed. They had better things to look at now. The town they would build would never make history books. It would never boast grand banks or wealthy merchants. But it would nurture generations of families who understood that true wealth lay not in what you could take, but in what you could give. And that was a fortune beyond any diamond's measure. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the Wild West, where love proved stronger than greed and courage more valuable than comfort. If you're listening to this story, I'd love to know where in the world you are. Please share in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel for more tales of frontier romance and adventure. What did Margaret's journey mean to you? Share your thoughts. I read every comment and love hearing how these stories touch your hearts.